Hello and welcome back to the Data Privacy Lawyer. My name is Funmi Owolabi and I'm the principal attorney at the firm. Today's review, we're going to be looking at a notice, a privacy notice. So it belongs to this organization called Stripe. I'm familiar with Stripe. This was last updated January 16, 2026, so not terribly long ago, which is good. It's a financial infrastructure for the internet. Okay, so this describes the personal data that's collected by the entity on how they use, share it, and how you can reach us with privacy-related inquiries. Okay, that's interesting. From a scope perspective, I'm intrigued about whether or not this notice is going to apply to employees' personal data that's collected, vendor personal data that's collected, or the personal data associated with individuals that visit the site. I've talked a lot about scope on this channel in the past. And basically, the reason why scope is so important is because different identifiers fulfill different needs. The data that a company collects on their employees is going to be very different to the data that's collected on a visitor to a website. The data that's collected related to vendors or suppliers of your business is going to be different to the personal data you collect on your employees, right? So having scope in your notice and being explicit about it is really, very important. Sometimes what organizations will do is they'll use very all-encompassing language to avoid any scrutiny from a regulator that they are not adhering to the data protection law, so they will leave the language very broad. The reason I find that to be not a great approach in 2026 is because the data protection laws are very, very sophisticated. There's specific things that have to be outlined in a notice that should be distributed to the applicable groups of individuals. And these notices become very long. When you do a notice that covers every type of processing, you have to think about audience. The regulators are not just looking at, you putting the information out there. They're also looking and considering, who is this for? Are people actually going to read this? Are we being transparent? If your notice is 100 pages long, how many consumers are going to read that? The only consumer that's going to read that is me, from a practical standpoint, because you can't just approach privacy exclusively from a legal perspective. Yes, it's very important, but you have to think about who are the regulatory bodies that are drafting or enforcing the legislation associated with privacy, and what would be their expectation. Some legislation actually expects companies to have a varied approach to their privacy notice. Data protection laws say that you have to address the tone and audience of the person who's going to be reading the notice. And that's why I think having different notices to address different types of processing is really important. So if I come across any notices on this channel that are layered or have the intended audience in mind, I'm going to continue to call that out, because I think it's very important for businesses to see how much thought really goes into drafting these notices. I, as a privacy practitioner, I'm the one that drafts notices. I'm the one that updates notices. So I see these constantly throughout the day. And I will say that in 2026, because the audience is becoming more savvy about their data, people are seeing things on the news related to fines and enforcement actions against companies that have misplaced privacy practices or aren't being transparent about how they use individuals' information. It's really important to address the audience when you're drafting a notice, and in doing so, addressing the scope. Now, I'm consuming this website. From this statement alone, describes the personal data we collect. There's not an outline of who the individuals are. Now, it might be below in the defined terms, but this is the first section that we're looking at. Now, from this sentence, I don't know if this privacy notice applies to me, who is a consumer of this site, right? I've logged onto the site, stripe.com. Now, from this sentence, I don't know if this notice applies to me, right? Because this sentence is so broad. The policy also outlines your rights and choices as a data subject. Which data subject are we addressing? Are we addressing the data subject me, as a consumer of your website? Are we addressing a data subject like your employees? Are we addressing your data subjects as a supplier or vendor? Who is the data subject in scope? This language is very broad. The other thing I want to mention about this particular word is this is a very privacy-centric terminology, and it may be that they define the terms below. Let's actually see. Let me see. That's so interesting. I'm going to make a note of this. You can see they've used the terminology data subject, but in their defined terms, they've moved to end user end customer, representative, or visitor. So they have decided on the scope here. They've told us it could be a customer, end user, representative, or visitor, which means that employees are out. But they haven't defined this term they've used. And you have to think, how many lay people that are consuming services of Stripe understand this? This is a privacy-centric term that privacy professionals and privacy lawyers understand. But the people that are reading this, like end users, does an end user who is using the payment method link understand who a data subject is? Do visitors of the website, general visitors, not a privacy lawyer like myself, do general visitors, and that's why I have to look at tone when you draft this. The other thing I want to make note of is, if we keep scrolling down, right, how many end users are going to keep on scrolling and read this entire thing? That's why I think it's valuable to separate these out based on groups of individuals. I'm going to read it and I'm going to draft things like this, but most of the audience and individuals in scope for this are not. Let's talk about something that I think is very important to look at. Categories of personal data. Now that we have outlined who's in scope, which is the end customers, the end users, the representatives, etc., something that I think is valuable to note is the personal data collected about end customers and why it's valuable to outline exactly the type of personal data in scope. Because we've identified 4 different categories of individuals for this notice, the types of personal data that are collected on each group may differ and have to be identified from a transparency perspective. So what we're looking at is, are we collecting the same amount of data from our end customers as we are from our representatives? If we are, it needs to be distributed on our notice. So I'm not entirely sure. Let's go to the top. I want to see what they consider to be a representative. A representative is when you're acting on behalf of an existing or potential business user, perhaps as a company founder, account administrator for a business, or a recipient of an employee credit card from a business user via Stripe. The type of personal data that is collected from a representative is going to differ a lot from a visitor, and it needs to be addressed. So that's why it's really important to put personal data that we collect, how we use it, and share it. And that's what's being demonstrated below. One of the things I think is valuable to know as well is whenever you're drafting these notices, you're looking at what you're doing internally. There's going to be documentation that is available to end customers on how Stripe processes their personal data that may be distributed outside of this notice we're seeing on the website, right? When Stripe is creating, or when a business is creating their internal documents, what they're reflecting on their website is what they're doing internally. They're saying to me as a visitor, when you interact with Stripe by visiting the site without being logged into a Stripe account, or when you interact with Stripe does not involve you being an end user or any of these. For example, you are a visitor when you send a message to Stripe asking for more information about our services. So I'm highlighting this because what I want to talk about is there is internal documentation that is distributed to Stripe employees or contractors on how processing associated with visitors can be done. Like a guide, it might say something like, when a visitor logs onto the website, you'll be able to identify their IP address. Make sure that you put it in X repository. That's just an example. I don't know because this is not a company. I'm just reviewing this from a consumer perspective and speculating to provide insight to businesses on what might be happening in the background. So there is internal documentation that's not being distributed. What happens when these notices are drafted is the business will look at what they're doing internally with data, and then they will make representations on their website about what it is that they're doing. And those representations have to align with what's happening internally. If you have an internal document you distribute to your employees and it says, hey, you need to handle personal data and categorize it as sensitive, or you need to send it to our third-party partner X, you need to be transparent about that on your website. What's internal has to be reflected externally, and it has to align so that you're not in jeopardy of being misunderstood as being deceptive under the FTC Act Section 5. All right, I really hope you enjoyed this review. If you have comments about what's been discussed, leave a comment below and I'll see you in another one.